Besides, also Cyrus, the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus king by the hand of Merodach the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them: 30 chargers of gold, 1,000 chargers of silver, 20 knives, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, as we continue to look at this passage and see how important it is that you move in the hearts of men. And tonight we're going to see the response to it, and then we're going to see a list of folks that went. And sometimes when we hit these lists, we get a little bored because the names are difficult to pronounce and it doesn't seem like it says a whole lot. But I trust tonight that by the time we're done with chapter 2, we'll realize how important people are to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Starts off here, and we were talking about the need for support as they went. And it's very interesting, the parallel that we see here as they're getting ready to leave the captivity in Babylon. And a lot of the same language occurs just like when they were getting ready to leave Egypt. It said they spoiled their neighbors. And when you read the account in Egypt, it almost sounds like they just, knocked on the door or broke in the door and went in there and stole everything. That's not really what it's talking about. What it's talking about is God moved in the hearts of the Egyptians to give them stuff to get them out of the country. Basically because Pharaoh's heart was hardened, but the people of the nation of Israel had had enough. They'd probably had enough a long time ago. I don't know if you've ever sat down and read through those plagues, but man, I'm telling you, when I read through them, I try to sit there and imagine what it must have been like to actually be living in that hot climate and have blood all over the water, to have lice everywhere, to have flies everywhere, to have frogs everywhere. And then Pharaoh says, take these things from us. And Moses stands out there and prays, and all the frogs die of a heart attack. And you're thinking, dude, what do you do with millions of dead frogs stinking up the place? I mean, it's no wonder that the flies came in afterwards, right? The grasshoppers come in and eat everything, and you have you have these plagues, and the Egyptian people are like, just let them go already. Send them, let them go. And here we see another great working, not only in the heart of Cyrus, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, and not only in the folks to go, but also in the folks that didn't go. And verse 5 through 11 is the response to what we saw last week when they have this incredible opportunity. The first thing I want you to see here in verse 5 is the travelers. He starts to list off, who is there among you of all his people, his God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem? Well, that asks a great question then. Who's going to go? Who answers the call? Who believes in this opportunity? Well, the answer is down in verse 5. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin. Now, I've told you over and over and over again, sometimes when we're reading in our daily devotions, we just get so caught up in reading through that we don't always slow down and stop and think for a minute. But one of the really important things that God does here is he lists out for us that he moved in the hearts of the leadership. That's what the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin. Now it's interesting because if you remember, Babylon attacks Judah. They don't necessarily attack the other 10 tribes because there's already been bedlam up there. Now, there are captives that have been taken from the other 10 tribes, but most of what they did is they attacked Jerusalem and they besieged it, and they eventually, the walls are torn down and the temple is destroyed. And so the large portion of the folks that from the Babylonian exile were taken from Judah. And if you remember when we were studying Daniel, they took the princes. They took those that would have been in succession to be on the throne. They took the priests and the doctors and the lawyers and the kids that were in college and the kids that were studying to be helpful and useful. And now you see here they are. These folks have probably been successful in Babylon. You know, they worked hard, they studied hard, they were folks that God had raised up for authority. But he moved in the hearts of the authority to have them go home. The next group that we see in the verse, and the Levites, the ministers, the priests and the Levites. Can I ask a question? What's the point of going back and rebuilding the temple if you don't have any priests and Levites? You'd have a building, but you wouldn't be able to use it. He stirred up the priests and the Levites. And then he also stirred up the people. And I like the phrase that he says, with all them whose spirit God had raised. Everyone sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. Now, we alluded to this last week. There are some that had to stay behind. I would imagine if Daniel is still alive at this time, and we don't know for sure that he is, but I can imagine that old man kneeling next to his windows that are open 3 times a day as he prays. And I can imagine as he watches the dust cloud leaving the city, that he is on his knees thanking God for answered prayer. There are older people who probably would have loved to go back to Jerusalem that will never get the opportunity to go back. But there were some who had the opportunity and didn't go back. Let's look at verse 6. And all they that were about them, that's the provision that's going to happen. And this is talking about the Gentiles. Strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, precious things. Interesting phrase here, beside all that was willingly offered. Now, the reason that's so interesting is it alludes to 2 different offerings. Cyrus makes his announcement and he says, you're going to be allowed to go back and build the temple. We're going to take up an offering to build the temple. But then you have all these folks who are going to have expenses as they travel, and when they get there, they are returning to a land where the fields aren't planted, where the grapevines haven't been taken care of, where a lot of places are in ruin. How are they supposed to support themselves while they're getting their agricultural and their industry started again? And so they take up an offering to help the people as well. Very interesting. You say, what kind of an offering? Well, let's see how God moves, because in verses 7 through 11, they not only take up these 2 offerings from everybody else, but he sends the temple treasure home as well. And he's going to share with us a little bit. I believe this is the fundamentals of how folks ought to handle money. Okay? I've told you before, there are a lot of parallels here between the folks returning from Babylon to Jerusalem and present-day missions. Sometimes you have to send money over to build a church or to buy a van or an airplane or whatever. You have a project offering. And then sometimes you're taking up an offering to send the people and to support them while they go and they minister. And we see that here. Now, how do you handle those funds? Well, look at what he does here. And starting in verse 7. Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus, king of Persia, bring forth by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer. Now, notice he had somebody who was in charge of the funds. This guy was responsible for it. And so he sends down and he tells Mithridath, you need to get out all of the things that we took from the temple in Jerusalem. We're going to send them back. Mithridath wasn't the treasurer when this came in, right? But notice he doesn't have any problem going into Cyrus's treasury house and knowing exactly what it is he is supposed to gather and give back to the Jews to take back to Jerusalem. The whole time Daniel has been in captivity, we're closing in on 90 years here of between Babylonian and the Persians. 70 years of captivity for them. Daniel's 80-some years old. You have a long time period here. But they know exactly what items they're supposed to get out of the treasury to send back to them. He is going to go through here because he has good accounting practices. And he lists out exactly what it is that he's going to give to them. Now, I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Number one, not only did he have good accounting practices, he knew what they were, he knew the value, and he knew the purpose. Look at verse 9. And other vessels, 1,000. Candlesticks, show plates for the bread, all these different things. He's got them all listed out, and he knows exactly how many he's supposed to get. Verse 11, all the vessels in gold and silver were 5,400. They're all listed out. They know what their purpose was. They knew what they were made of. They knew what their value is. It's all been taken care of. And so he calls the treasurer and he says, you need to go and get the stuff for the temple. We're going to send it. They're going to take it back. And the man goes down there and he looks down through his list and he gets exactly what he's supposed to get and he hands it over to just anyone? No. Who's he give it to? He gives it unto somebody that can be trusted. Look at the end of verse 8. And he numbered them. When he numbered them, that means he gave them to him with an accounting. He didn't just walk out there with a bunch of sacks over his shoulder, chuck them in a wagon and say, there you go, see you later. No, he walked out with an itemized list and said, this is what I am giving to you. This is what the king expects to be in the temple in Jerusalem when you get it built. And they put them in the wagons. You say, well, who in the world is Sheshbazzar? I mean, we don't hear this guy's name. Well, you know what? Apart from the book of Daniel, you never hear of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego either. Why? Because it's not their real names. Right? In fact, we call him Daniel, but that's not what they called him. And that's exactly what the situation is here. They chose somebody that they could trust. Sheshbazzar, interestingly, is his Persian name. You know what it means? Talk about joy and tribulation. Now listen, this guy, his Jewish name is Zerubbabel. And that's how we know him, because we've heard of Zerubbabel trying to build the temple, right? And in charge of getting all these people back safely. We're familiar with Zerubbabel. This man was an officer in the Persian court. He is of the household and lineage of David. So he was one of those princes that they would have taken, probably the son of one of those princes that they would have taken captive when they took Daniel. And here you have this younger man, maybe even a grandson, who is of the lineage of David. And his name, his Persian name, is a testimony to the fact that yes, it's been 70 years of tribulation, but there's been joy in that tribulation. And the joy of the tribulation is getting ready to lead them home. Now tell me God doesn't care about the little details. The only conclusion that we can draw from this is how amazing God is in working in human hearts. He works in Cyrus. He works in the leadership. He works in the ministers. He works in the people to go. He worked in the Jews and the Gentiles alike to provide gifts for building the temple and for providing for the people not only during their journey, but also in getting themselves established. And he sends home thousands of the temple treasure. It's probably worth millions of dollars in today's money to be able to start the temple. What an interesting chapter to start this incredible book. Now, if you will, flip the page. Because I told you we'd be in chapters 1 and 2. And here we are in chapter 2, and they're getting ready. I call this a boring lesson about a detailed God. Because if you sit down and you start reading down through here, long about the time you get to verse 3, you're ready for your bedtime reading. These are the children of the province that went up out of captivity of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his own city. Now it's been 70 years. Which came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, not the same Nehemiah that built the wall, by the way. Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, not the same guy from Esther, different guy. Bilshan, Mispar, Bigva, Rehum, Bana. You see why I didn't have you read it this afternoon? I figured most of you would give up right about there. The number of the men of the people of Israel. Now he starts off, and I said we're not going to take the time to read all this, but I want to start reading it. The children of Parash, 2,172. The children of Shephthai, 372. The children of Era, 775. The children of Paath Moab, of the children of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812. The children of Elam, 1,254. The children of Zatu, 945. And literally it goes on for almost the rest of the entire chapter. And you say, what is the big deal? Listen, here's the big deal. When we go down through here and we read these genealogies, we want to start yawning and we can't pronounce the names and we're thinking, why in the world does God put these big long lists of thousands of people in there? What difference does it make? 70 years later, there are a lot of folks that have died that are never going to get to go back. But God has written down in his book every single one of them that gets to go back. And to him, it is not the children of Erah, 775. In his book, he has 775 names written down for that town. Do you understand what he's telling us here? He is reading off towns that have been conquered and decimated and destroyed by the Babylonian army, and folks carried off into captivity, and God says, I have not forgotten you. Of this little town, 945 people are going to get to go home. And in his book, he knows every one of them by name. He knows the very hairs on their head. He hasn't forgotten. We have the names of leadership, princes, or of David's lineage starting out. And then we have a list of Jewish nationals. And then as we get down towards the end of the chapter, we have some priests that are listed. Then we have temple workers made up of singers, musicians, porters, etc. And then we have slaves, Nethinims, and many that were Midianites and Gibeonites that were captured a long, long time ago. And we'll get there in just a minute, but I want to show you some notables. Look at verse 7. We already read it. The children of Elam, 1,254. Get down to verse 31. The children of the other Elam, 1,254. I was reading down through here and I thought, are you kidding me? And so I went back to verse 7 and I looked at it and I thought, 1,254, and I wrote it on my little blotter on my desk. And I went back down to verse 31 and I looked at it, and how much is it? God says there are two towns in the nation of Israel. There's Elam, and then there's that other Elam. There's two Elams. How many people are going back to the one? 1,254. How many are going back to the other Elam? Now listen, if I were God, I would have left that out, because I know what people are thinking. They're thinking somebody messed up somewhere in the counting, and they counted Elam twice. And God's saying, I don't care if you come from the same town. I don't care if there's the same number of people in there. There's all kinds of statistics. But you know what, folks? You're not a statistic in God's eyes. There's Elam, and there's the other Elam. And they may have had the same number of folks going back, but in God's book, it doesn't just say Elam and the other Elam. Remember, he has the name of 1,254 people, and they're not going to that town. They're going to this town because that's where they belong. And these guys aren't going to this town over here. They're going to their town because that's where their heritage was given. And if you go all the way back to the time of Joshua, you can trace these folks to their town. And Joshua's giving this area to them. And it says, it shall be an inheritance unto you for how long? He says forever. Do you realize it hasn't been that long since Israel's been a country again? They lost their identity and their land and everything until, was it 41? Hasn't been that long ago. And when he called them back from Germany and Spain and France and the United States and Canada and Mexico and wherever else they were, he brought them back to where? He brought them back to their land. And they can still go through their scrolls and they can still look up the land that Joshua divided unto them and that has been handed down for an heritage for thousands of years. My God is a detailed God and he cares, even if we don't. Verse 23. This one's incredible. The men, that's it? That's all that come from this town? Well, listen. How many people would be coming back to Klitschko? Does that mean you don't care about Klitschko? If we were returning from captivity to Klitschko, he'd have our little town listed and he'd say how many names are going to be there. And it's easy to read over this and not understand. But folks, you have to understand. So go with me to Jeremiah chapter 32. Because in Jeremiah 32, God asks Jeremiah to do the craziest thing. In fact, in human terms, it's dumb. It is really not smart. But he does it for one very distinct reason. In Jeremiah 32, look at verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. For then the king of Babylon's army besieged Jerusalem. And Jeremiah the prophet was shut up in the court of the prison, which was in the king of Judah's house. Now you got the picture, right? He's already carried off a bunch of captives, and there's been a little bit of a revolt going on, and they're sick and tired of the nation of Israel, so now he is besieging them, and this is when he's getting ready to go in, and they tear down the wall so that there's not a stone standing upon another, and they out time the word of the Lord came to him. And Jeremiah's probably thinking, I'd be better off if you'd leave me alone. I mean, I don't know how much worse things can get. Look at verse 3. For Zedekiah king of Judah had shut him up, saying, Wherefore dost thou prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall take it. And Zedekiah king of Judah shall not escape out of the hand of the Chaldeans, but shall surely be delivered. Speak with him mouth to mouth. And he shall lead Zedekiah to Babylon, and there shall he be until I visit him, saith the Lord. Jeremiah said, The word of the Lord came unto me, saying. Now here he is. This is what God tells him while he's in prison. Behold, Hanameel, the son of Shallum, thine uncle, shall come unto thee, saying, Buy thee my field that is in what? Does that name sound familiar? Because there's 128 people getting ready to go home to that town. For the right of redemption is thine to buy it. So what happens in the nation of Israel, if somebody wants to sell the field, they have to offer it to the closest kin. It's called the right of redemption. And it keeps the land with the people that it was supposed to be when Joshua divided it up among all the tribes and the families all that long time ago. So here you have Jeremiah. He is sitting in prison, and the word of the Lord comes to him. He says, pretty soon one of your relatives is going to show up. Your uncle's going to send you a messenger, and he's going to ask if you want to buy this field. What in the world is Jeremiah going to do with a field while he's in prison? And can I suggest to you, what in the world is he going to do when he just got done saying, surely the word of the Lord is true, and there's not going to be much left in Jerusalem and Israel very much longer because the king of Babylon getting ready to lay waste to it. Why would you buy a field when King Nebuchadnezzar's army is getting ready to trample through it and destroy Jerusalem? Verse 8, so Hanameel, mine uncle's son, came to me in the court of the prison according to the word of the Lord, and said unto me, buy my field, I pray thee, that is in Anathoth, which is in the country of Benjamin, for the right of inheritance is thine, and the redemption is thine. Buy it for thyself. Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord, and I bought the field of Hanameel, my uncle's son, that was in Anathoth, paid him the money, even 17 shekels of silver. You know what's worse than not having your freedom and being in prison? Spending all your money on something you don't get to enjoy while you're in prison. Verse 10, here we go. Carefully handling money again. And I subscribed the evidence, and I sealed it, and I took witnesses, and I weighed him the money in the balances. So I took the evidence of the purchase, both that which was sealed according to the law and custom, and that which was open. And you listening carefully? I gave the evidence of the purchase unto Baruch, the son of Neriah, the son of Masai, in the sight of Hanameel, mine uncle's son, and in the presence of the witnesses that subscribed the book of the purchase before all the Jews that sat in the court of the prison. And I charged Baruch before them, saying, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, take these evidences, this evidence of the purchase, both which is sealed, and this evidence which is open, and put them in an earthen vessel, that they may continue many days. Why in the world is he burying an important court document in a vessel? Why not take it to the bank? Because there isn't going to be a bank. Why not take it to the temple and lock it up real soon? Because there isn't going to be a temple to lock it up in. There isn't going to be a safe place. Not the king's palace, not a house. So what he does is he turns around, and knowing that Jeremiah is never going to recognize the benefit of this, he follows what God tells him. He buys the field, and then he turns around and he gives it away. And he tells the man in front of all these witnesses, so everybody knows that it now belongs to these individuals, go out in the field and bury the evidence in an earthen jar. And that's what they do. And very shortly after that, Nebuchadnezzar rides into town and he wipes everything out. And for 70 years, there is an earthen jar buried in a field in Anathoth. And we're reading down through here, and we get to verse 23, and we read, and this town and 128 people, and we skip right over it and think, what's the big deal? The big deal is the 128 individuals include somebody who never even got to enjoy the gift that Jeremiah gave them, who never got to enjoy the land that he purchased. He simply obeyed what God told him to do. He gave the land away. They went out and buried the jar. They get hauled off captive. And now 70 years later, somebody's coming back. And what are they going to do? They're going to go out in the middle of that field and they're going to do what? They're going to dig up an earthen jar. And they have a possession in Israel. Because God told Jeremiah to do that before the captivity even started. Do you see what I'm telling you? It's a long list of bubbas that are really hard. I don't know of anybody who could probably pronounce them, because some of them even are part Persian and part Jewish, and so who knows how in the world you pronounce all these. But there's 128 men that are returning to Anathoth, and some of them have never seen their possession, and they never even had to purchase the possession. But they're about to receive a blessing from God. That's called mercy, love, and grace. How about the singers and the Levites? Go down to verse 40 of Ezra chapter 2. Verse 40. The Levites, the children of Jeshua and Kadmiel, of the children of Hodaviah, 74. Look at verse 41. The singers, the children of Asaph, 128. You can read right over that and you think, no big deal. Can I? Whoa. Hold up just a minute. How many priests and Levites are there in the nation of Israel? A whole tribe. Do you understand that only 74 are going home from captivity? 74. Now, I didn't run down through here and carefully check every single number, but I did waste some time looking this week. And 74 is the lowest number I saw of anybody returning. There are podunk little towns that have more than 74 people going back to them. 74? You say, why are only 74 priests returning? Well, I don't know what's in their heart, but I can guess. When a priest goes back to the nation of Israel, where do they live? They don't have any inheritance in the nation of Israel, right? They're supposed to scatter out and live with other people. How do you live with someone else if someone else doesn't have a home? They don't get paid. They get paid out of the offerings, the sacrifices that come to the temple. They took out a certain portion of the meat, that's what they ate. They got a certain portion of the giving that supported the temple. They don't have a temple yet. They don't have temple service instituted yet. So I would imagine the priests are looking around going, I'm not sure what we're going back to. We'll just hang get the temple and everything built and everything gets going, and then we'll head on back. But then in verse 41, you have these singers. The singers are the ones who are supposed to stand in the temple and lead worship. Well, they don't have a temple. How many of them go back? Almost twice as much. God found almost twice as many people who were willing to worship Him as were willing to serve Him. For crying out loud, folks. But I guess maybe the singers had something to sing about, didn't they? So they didn't hold back. Look at verses 42 through 58. We're not going to read it all. But in verses 42 through 58, we have the temple slaves and their kids. The Nethinims means appointed ones. So when they conquered, and most of them were Midianites and Gibeonites, but they took them slaves. You remember the Midianites pulled that, I believe it was the Midianites, pulled the big fake job with Joshua. They put on the ratty clothes and they ate a bunch of moldy bread and they acted like they were coming from a long, long way when actually they were one of the next cities that would have been conquered. And as a result, Joshua, without asking God's advice, made a league with them so he can't break his word and kill them all like he was supposed to. So instead, they took everyone and they became slaves to the nation of Israel. Now, here's interesting. Because what in the world could be worse than being hauled off to Babylonian captivity and be a Jew? How about being hauled off to Babylonian captivity and being a Jewish slave? You notice it doesn't give numbers. It gives a number for the whole group that goes back. It says, the children of Ziha, the children of Heshbajah, the children of, 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 and you get way down there and it says all together. Why doesn't it give numbers? Because they didn't have a choice. They're slaves. And so all of them went back. Down in verse 65, you have servants that are listed. And it says, besides their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337. Now that's a pretty incredible statement because they're taking home 3,337 servants. Can I suggest to you that if the nation of Israel really wanted to make some quick money, they could have sold those slaves in Babylon. There would have been a ready supply, right? I mean, there would have been a lot of folks who would have wanted a manservant or a maidservant. But they took them back with them to the nation of Israel. And then in verse 66 through 69, we have this look. I don't spend a lot of time here because I want to quickly look at some consequences. But I do want to touch on it. Because if you'll remember last week, I said not everybody could give gold or silver. Look at this overwhelming response. And some of these figures are just staggering. They're staggering. Their horses were 736. Their mules 245. Their camels 435. Their asses 6,720. That's a lot of animals. That's a lot of animals. And some of the chiefs of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave, interesting phrase, I love this phrase, after their what? Some gave a nickel. Some gave $1. Some gave $1,000. It didn't matter in God's sight, because he said they gave according to their ability unto the treasure of the work, 61,000 drams of gold. You know what a dram is? It's a drachma, a gold coin. A drachma is a gold coin. They gave 61,000 drachma. I have no idea how much that would be worth in today's money, but that's a lot of money. 61,000 gold coins. 5,000 what? Of two and a half what? Tons. Right? 2.5 tons of silver? And 100 priests' garments. You say, why did they throw that in? I'll tell you why. You ready? Because this is the heartfelt part of it. It's easy to give gold and silver. But what have they been doing with priest garments for 70 years? Answer? Nothing. In fact, there's a good possibility that they don't even have any. So how in the world did they get 100 priest garments? Can you picture it with me? Little kid comes home from school, walks in the door. Grandma, what are you doing? I'm making a priest garment. You're doing what? I'm making a priest garment. And she's going to town, she's cutting carefully, and she's sewing, and man, it's linen. She is working careful. And she sits there hour after hour after hour. Why are you making a priest's garment, Grandma? Because Cyrus said we get to go home. We're going to go home and build a temple. And if you're going to build a temple, you have to have priests. And priests don't just wear anything. They have to wear special clothes. So hour after hour, while everybody else is gathering up the animals, and everybody else is gathering up the gold, and everybody else is gathering up the silver, I see a bunch of little old ladies who can't go and gather up gold and silver, and can't, but you know what they're doing? They're sewing their fingers sore. And by the time they get all the other stuff together, parade of dust starts to leave Babylon, they have made 100 garments. And you know what? There's only 74 priests to wear them. Isn't that a shame? The grandmas thought bigger than the priests did. It's easy as we go down through here to see all the bubbles and think, what is the big deal? But all of the folks who were sitting around sewing those garments, that's a big deal. I imagine the stories that they told their kids and their grandkids while they sat there and sewed on those. Let's go back up to verse 59 and 60, because I want you to see some consequences before we close tonight. We have all these lists of folks who get to go back to their hometown. We even have all these children of slaves, and the shame of it is, all of these slaves know who their dads are, and they're listed out. The children of so-and-so, and the children of so-and-so, and the children of so-and-so, and the total was, down to the last person, they know the total. But look at verse 59 and 60. And these were they that went up from Tel-Melal, Tel-Harsha, Cherub, Aden, and Immar. Now these are not places in Israel. Okay? You listening? They could not show whether they were of Israel. You have this group of people who wants to go back to Israel. But if you can't show your father's seed in your household and your lineage, then there's no inheritance waiting for you. You go back there and all you get to do is spend the rest of your days being a visitor. You are not a naturalized Jewish citizen. They could not prove their heritage. There is no inheritance. And they are allowed to go back. But they are going to be very limited, as we'll see much later, in their service as they go. You say, man, what a shame. It is a shame. But look at verses 61 through 63. And the children of the priests, who in the nation of Israel were allowed to be priests? The tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi only. Right? This should have been a piece of cake. And of the children of the priests, the children of Habiah, and the children of Koz, and the children of Barzillai, which took a wife of the daughter of Barzillai the Gileadite, and was called after their name. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found, therefore were they as polluted put. What? They wanted to go. They wanted to serve, but they couldn't. They could not prove their heritage, and so they were considered polluted in service and privilege, and they were not allowed to do for God what they wanted to do for him. Now notice, they didn't spit on them, make fun of them, take them outside the gates of Babylon and stone them. Look at the very next verse. And the Tirshatha said unto them that they should not eat of the most holy things. You say, what is the big deal with that? I don't understand what the problem is. If you're not a priest, remember, the priests made their living from the sacrifices that were brought to the temple. And so something that was sacrificed to God, the priests would get a part of the meat, and that's how they got their food. But if you're not a legitimate priest, you're not allowed to eat of that holy sacrifice. Go with me to Leviticus chapter 22. Leviticus chapter 22. My holy name and those things which they hallow unto me, I am the Lord. And we don't have the time to look at it, but in the following verses, there's a very clear, listen, somebody from your seed eats of the hallowed things, this is what's going to happen to them. Now, go down to verse 10. There shall no stranger eat of the holy thing, talking about the meat that came from the sacrifice. A sojourner of the priest or a hired servant shall not eat of the holy thing. In other words, they were so particular that if you went to visit a priest's house and he was having a meal that day, God says to them, make sure you do not take something that was offered to me and given to you to provide for you. Don't you dare give it to a sojourner or a friend or a neighbor. It was only to be eaten by a Levite. So we have a really big problem here because you have these folks who want to travel back to Jerusalem, but they can't prove their lineage. How are they going to make a living? That's the problem that comes up. What's the solution? Well, if you go back and you finish the verse in Ezra, he says, wait until the high priest can decide with the Urim and the Thummim. Turn to Numbers chapter 27 as we close. Numbers chapter 27. Know of God, they would take those stones off of his chest plate. Don't ask me how they did it, if they were tied on or whatever. Would cast them before the Lord. And God would use them to answer the priest, whatever it was. In Numbers chapter 27, verse 21, we see a situation. And it says, "And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord. At his word shall they go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, even all the congregation." And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. And he took Joshua, and he set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and he laid his hands upon him, and he gave him charge as the Lord commanded by the hand of Joshua. So they walk in there and they say, "Is Joshua the chosen one?" And they cast the Urim and the Thummim, and God shows and says, "Yes." So here, this wise man says, "Man, we have a real predicament, because these people, we're going to have to figure out, they're not allowed to eat of the offering when we get back to Jerusalem. And then we have to figure out, has God called them to be a priest or not? Because there's no way of proving it." Can I suggest to you that every good Jew could prove his lineage? To have your name written in Ezra chapter 2 as not being able to prove your lineage was the hugest slap in the face to a Jewish person that I can think of. They are so proud of their heritage. They are so proud of their lineage. And here you have two groups of individuals, one of them people and one of them priests, that cannot prove their lineage. Consequences? The one group doesn't have an inheritance, and the other group doesn't get to serve. You say, how are we going to deal with this? Well, they're going to take all those guys that tried to be priests, and they're going to line them up before the Lord when there is a high priest. So you can imagine how long this is going to take, right? Because they don't have a temple and they don't have priests going yet. When there's a high priest, we'll sanctify him, and we'll get the ephod, and we'll have the Urim and the Thummim, and we'll have a ceremony, and we'll bring them in one at a time, and we'll cast before the Lord, and he'll say yes, or he'll say no. We're going to stand before him someday. I want to hear, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Don't you? Well, then we better be working at it to make sure we hear that. Whole big long chapter. It's almost as bad as so-and-so begat so-and-so, right? But if you take the time to dig, you find towns like Anathoth. A promise before the trouble even descends that it's only going to be for a certain time, and that God knows exactly who's coming back to that little field. That one little field. I mean, how insignificant is that one little field? It's not insignificant in the eyes of a detailed God. So while it might seem like a lot of boring reading to you, to God, it's the names of thousands of people he has been bringing home, just like he promised, after 70 years, so that they could be a people like he promised, because he always keeps his promises. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your faithfulness. And I am sure that most people were in great tumult when Nebuchadnezzar was besieging the city of Jerusalem and tearing up the countryside. And yet you are promising folks, probably that haven't even been born yet, that there would come a time that they would come back and enjoy the land you had promised them. Father, it makes me wonder how many blessings we miss because of our sin and pride. We can see 70 years of wasted life for Israel because of chasing after idolatrous gods instead of seeking whole heart. If we want revival in our city, if we want revival in our church, if we want revival in Dickinson County, we're going to have to stop running after everything else and seek you with a whole heart, fervently. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Have a wonderful evening.